Spirit. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all of our actions by your inspiration and help us to carry them out with your grace and assistance, so that every prayer and good work of ours may always begin from you and through you be brought to completion. We make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. There have been a few momentous events which have changed the world, or at least the European world. And one of them was in 1066. It's called the Norman Invasion. I have a particular interest in it because that's my people. William the Conqueror's grandfather was a descendant of Rollo the Norseman. And in the 800s, 900s, the Vikings were taking over here, there, and everywhere, raids and bringing their longboats up and down rivers in Europe and British Isles. And the Danes, the Norwegians, the Swedes were all considered one people called Vikings, or people from the north, Northmen. And so they took over northwestern France and formed an area called Normandy, Norseman, the Norseman land. And within 2 generations, they become civilized, so to speak, partially civilized. Still, they get rid of all of their barbaric ways, but at least they baptized them and were somewhat Christianized. And there was a fellow by the name of Richard Count Devereux, who also got married, and they said they passed laws saying that bishops and archbishops aren't to be married, and he said, well, it's not the archbishop who's getting married, it's the count who's getting married. Very clever sophistry, and it seemed to work. His son was also an archbishop. I don't know what his little sophistry was. But Richard's grandson was William, Duke of Normandy, who became King of England when he defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. The Normans then did a tremendous invasion, which was not your ordinary invasion. It was an upheaval in society which destroyed practically all of the Celtic life and observances in England and Wales eventually. And then 90 years later, they moved on to Ireland. They took over Dublin, Wicklow, Waterford, and Wexford and established the area called the Pale. And then from then they went on to conquer the rest of Ireland. They brought Roman practices with them, and in so doing, a lot of the Celtic culture was destroyed. I mentioned to you in the previous sessions how the Celtic monks, or the Irish monks, were not just a bunch of guys in black robes with a Bible and a crucifix running in here, there, and everywhere to convert people. Irish monasticism involved whole villages of people, men, women, children, orphans, widows, virgins, deacon, priest, bishop, abbot or abbess, who ran the community, children, teenagers, all sorts of folks. And they had a way of life that was very close, as close as they could get to living according to the Gospels. And by living the Gospels so faithfully and so well, they shared their faith wherever they moved or transplanted themselves to. And they had a way of conquering that ensured stability. Every 10 miles, they set up a castle or a keep or a stronghold. So England was dotted, Normandy was dotted, eventually Ireland was dotted, almost on a grid. So if there was any trouble anywhere, they just set up some flares, some torches up at the top of the tower, and all the neighboring nobles who saw this fire came to the rescue, came to solve the problem, and they did it swiftly and they did it well. Very efficient, law and order. Eventually, they ran in conflict with the King of France, and Joan of Arc claims that she had visions, to instate the King of France as the total ruler of all of France and to get rid of the Normans. In those days, they were then considered English. But most of them didn't spend much time in England. They did continue to spend time in Normandy, and they continued to speak French even in England. So Joan of Arc and her crowd was successful in getting the Normans out of France and bringing French rule of the Dauphin King to all of France. At the time they were ousted, they were very, very powerful group of people, and they also had extensive land holdings in France, as well as in England and Wales. So this was something very upsetting to them, but eventually it happened. And the Normans have since gone on. The leaders in the Crusades, they had a lot of responsibility in tossing out the Islamics from Malta and from southern Italy and Sicily and that sort of thing. So they did some beneficial things, but it was a lot of us always at the edge of a sword or the point of a sword. They were a tough bunch. But I get a little bit upset about just Joan of Arc. I'm awfully glad they never named me pastor. Never named me pastor at St. Joan of Arc in Yountville because I had a hard time. Okay. Again, but this is all an indication of the power struggles that have characterized society from the dawn of written history. Power, power, power. Conflict of this power against that power. Church leaders against civil rulers against church leaders who were in league with civil powers. Another example of that is the Avignon papacy. Rome was not a pleasant place to live. And so it's not surprising that that when the opportunity arose, the Pope moved from Rome to Avignon, which was a papal territory. It's way up in southern France, southeastern France. I've been to both places. I've been to Rome and I've been to Avignon. Avignon's a very, very pleasant resort place. And the Pope's palace and all of the offices there were very, very, very commodious, very pleasant. I remember when I was there one time, they took us on a tour, and the tour group had gone into the next room, and I'm a little slower than others, and so when the tour guide and all were in the next room, I actually sat in the Pope's throne. Just for the fun of it. But the Avignon exile also meant that the French monarchs were controlling the papacy and controlling the church. And it was also a time when in Rome, when there were terrible conflicts between leading families. Colonnas and the Orsinis, for example, were always fighting with each other about ascendancy. And a lot of young toughs were rioting, and a lot of banditry, and a lot of physical abuse, and people were being bumped off, and it was a violent place. Then also, it was getting slummy, getting run down, getting to be a dump, literally. And so, the popes, when they had the opportunity, moved to Avignon, but there they became pawns of the French king. And the popes in Avignon then made an awful lot of French bishops and cardinals. So it ensured that the Avignon exile would last for a long time. And it was, they say that the 13th was the greatest of centuries. Well, that's not such a great thing at all. But anyway, they needed money. So what do? They sold cardinals' hats to all these French bishops. Still needed money. So what do? They sold every diocese they could possibly sell, or abbacy. That's the head of an abbey they could sell. Okay, well, they still needed more money. And then they created this new institution called Monsignor. And these guys got to dress up in magenta robes and be prelates and chaplains to His Holiness, or prelates of honor, or domestic prelates, or protothonatory apostolic. They could even dress up like bishops with a mitre and a ring and a pectoral cross and all the whole bit Marianne, and celebrate Mass like a bishop with the extra ceremonials. But you didn't get them, you didn't pass those out for free. No. And it costs bucks, you know? You have to pay money to get this honor, okay? All right. So the bishops got a little bit ticked because up until then, the robes of bishops was a dark green, this color. And they wanted to dress up like these guys who were kind of dressed up like cardinals. So all on their own, they switched colors, and they were dressing up like monsignors. So if a priest thinks that he's dressing up like a bishop, actually it's the bishop who's dressing up like a monsignor. Historically. Now, Pope Francis, incidentally, has stopped the top grades of Monsignor. It's only the low-ranking kind that are still being made. That's the chaplains to His Holiness. And you have to be over 65 now, under his reign, to become a Monsignor. Most priests over 65 couldn't care less. They're thinking of, be sure that they get the medication and take it. They can get up those stairs, you know, or that they haven't forgotten something. So, I don't know if we're going to see very many more. Travis made one way back in the 70s, but I never called myself that.
Oh, you were?
Huh?
You really had one senior?
Oh, yeah, a long time.
Oh, but you don't own it.
What?
You don't own it though.
Well, I don't deny it, but I don't wear the costume.
Oh, and you don't call yourself
No, I
Monsignor.
don't.
Your father.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or doctor. Bishop always calls me doctor. Doctor. Bishop Walter always called me doctor, never. That's nice.
So you're the sorry.
All right, but anyhow, so the Avignon exile put the church into a position where France was running the church. And then a little sister by the name of Catherine of Siena pointed her famous finger at the Pope in Avignon and said, "You get your little self back to Rome where you belong." And he did. I've been to Siena, got her finger in a case. Also got her head in the other room, but her body is at Sofa Minerva, right back of the Pantheon. And her head is a wax one there. The real one is in Siena. And her spiritual director cut her head off after she died.
Yeah.
It's a funny operation sometimes, this Catholic Church. You don't tell anybody how they, what a peculiar bunch. Anyhow, her heart was in Rome, but her head was back home.
It's real.
It happened. So the Pope got back to Rome, and then after he died, then they elected another one. After a short while, the French were very satisfied with him, and so they went and elected their own Pope. So then we had the real Pope in Rome, and then we had the fake Pope back in Avignon. And then they tried to solve the problem, and they elected another one, and he ended up in Pisa. And then he had somebody else, and he was alternately in Venice, or all over the place, so then they ended up with 4 popes. So the Catholic people of Europe from 1378 to 1423 didn't know who was the Pope. And even saints like Vincent Ferrer, he was on the side of the wrong Pope. But this book that you gave me, boy, it sure puts the church in an awfully bad light. But the average person well, they didn't have seats I was going to say the average Catholic in the pew, but whatever he was sitting on, he wasn't aware of all of this, and the bishops and archbishops didn't share it. Most of the priests didn't even know that there were a bunch of popes. It was a pretty political thing. It was awfully confusing to leaders and to bishops and archbishops in the world. And also was scandalous to the East, the Orthodox and Eastern Christians, who were really not totally severed from union with Rome. But looking at this clown act that was going on, they weren't too impressed or inclined to come back into union with the Roman Church. We also had a council in which the schism was ended, and Martin V became the real Pope. But this really, really weakened the church. And then after Martin V, we had some horrible, horrible popes. The most notorious was Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, he was a criminal. He had a wife and he had kids and even had incestuous relationships with some of his kids, and they poisoned their enemies, and he himself probably ended up being poisoned. We're not talking about nice people here. Again, people like Julius II came in, he was a warrior. In defense of the papal territory, he himself put on a suit of armor, put a strapped sword to his waist and slashed around, and then if he won a victory, he'd go to the nearest church and put on a cope, that's the cape, you know, and put his bishop's hat on and chant the Te Deum. So, Lord, we give you praise and thanks. But he was certainly not a man of peace. He was a warrior, a butcher. He's the one that started the new St. Peter's, which was tumbling down. It was a wreck. And they hired people like Michelangelo and Raphael and Bernini and Da Vinci to put the place together. So how do you think they got money for this? Well, they sold more Monsignors, sold more Cardinals' hats, they sold more dioceses. And then they came up with indulgences. You bought your way out of purgatory and into heaven with a sale of indulgences. And they weren't cheap either. Well, then you came along and people like Waldo and John Hus and John Wycliffe and Tinsdale and Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli, and denouncing all this corruption and simony and sin, and they wanted a pure religion. They wanted a faithful following of the Gospels, and so they tossed out a lot of the good stuff along with the crap. I must say that they were all deeply sincere people. I question Wycliffe. He was a bit, or not Wycliffe, Ulrich Zwingli, he was a bit too tough. And people like Thomas Cromwell, and the English, so-called English Reformation was a land grab, really. And then Luther himself got tangled up with the German lords, who'd always had their eyes on church property. So, the worms they came up with, cuius regio ilius religio, the one who's in charge of the territory determines the religion. Wow, perfect opportunity for this duke or this margrave or this count or whatever to take over something, you know. So there was a simplification that the Puritans were into. Luther pretty much kept everything as was. Catholic Church is what he was most familiar with. But Wycliffe and John Calvin, who was a French lawyer, he came up with a huge book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And I have known lots of Presbyterian and Congregational and Reformed church ministers. None of them have ever read it. Modern day Presbyterians never read it. But they simplified things. Luther, for the most part, kept all 7 sacraments. But Wycliffe and Hus and Waldo and Calvin came down with 2, baptism and Eucharist. And they didn't believe in the real present, as do we. Instead, they believed that in impanation, that Christ is in the bread. Our belief in the Latin Church is that The bread and wine is transformed into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. The accidents of bread and wine remain the same, but the substance is now Christ, true God and true man, fully. We reserve the Eucharist for the sick, and because it is the Lord, we adore. But the Lutherans and they have an eternal light which burns where the tabernacle used to be. And nobody knows why they have the eternal light. But it's a vestige from when the former Catholic, now Lutheran churches had a tabernacle. I heard a couple of American students, Catholics, went over to Sweden to work on their doctoral dissertations. So they went to a very quiet place way out in the boonies in Sweden, which has a lot of boonies. Anybody ever been to Sweden? It is a lot of wilderness there, right?
Yes.
Okay. So they went to this little village, and the only church there was the Evangelical Church, the Church of Sweden. And they went to this little Lutheran church, and they saw that when the people came in the door, that they genuflected once they got to their seat. And they put their hand near the entrance, but there's nothing there to put their hand into. They signed themselves, and then, as I say, they genuflected. And they also bowed in this direction, and they genuflected in that direction. But there's nothing over there, and there's nothing over there. So while these doctoral students were in this town, they asked, why do you do this? We always did this. Well, we always did it. The oldest person was asked, why do you do this? They signed the cross and genuflected. We always did it. So they were doing some repair work on this church. They pulled up the floor, a wooden floor. Underneath the wooden floor, which was giving away from age and rot, they found a stone floor. And where the people were going like this with their hand was the stump, the base of what had been the baptistry. Then they tore off the back wall. There was a false works. Tore off the back wall, and what do they feel over here was a beautiful fresco of the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus on that wall. And on this wall, covered up with a false wall, was an aumbrey, or ancient tabernacle door. So all those years these people have been bowing in this and that because of what had been in the church. So the Lutheran Church in the Scandinavian countries very gradually became Protestant. Whereas in Germany it was a pretty abrupt move. Then in Switzerland and Scotland under John Knox, they just smashed out the stained glass windows and whitewashed the walls of pictures of saints, and even Bible scenes got whitewashed. Statues were pulled down from their pedestals and turned into gravel, and relics of the saints were destroyed, burned up. Catholic books were burned up. Nuns were thrown out of their convents. Monks were tossed out of their monasteries, and priests were sent packing. And they replaced everything with a very, very simple pulpit, and no kneelers, and maybe a table that they pulled out for communion, and that was it. Well, there's a church of St. Thomas the Apostle in Strasbourg, which was Protestant, Huguenot, Reformed Church of France. A couple of Protestant reformers with him, Munzer and Kratzer, were there. Okay, Bucher. I went in there. It's an old place called Petite France on the Rhine River in Strasbourg. And it's pretty sterile, whitewashed, everything's whitewashed. Plain glass windows, I've got a prominent pulpit. And tiny, oh my goodness, the altar's 2/3 the size of this table and kind of low. Not at all a prominent thing. So I was with a bunch of people, and one person hollered, "Hey, Father, come on over here!" So I went over to a room about, half the size of this one. And lo and behold, there were 2 caskets. One of a little girl, and the other of a general, Gustavus Adolphus, who had been a leading Protestant general and commander advancing the Protestant cause in Europe. And they were mummified or petrified, or I don't know how they fixed them up that way, but anyhow, under a glass top casket on sawhorses. And I thought to myself, people just can't get away from this stuff. They might toss the relics of St. Andrew, but here they bring in this guy, these people, this little girl, and the stuff is a dose. But the irony of it is that sometimes the very people that did all this, they did that to them too, like John Knox, who brought Protestantism into Scotland and basically got buried Queen of Scots out. He's buried in the churchyard and they paved over his grave. So much love and respect do they have for him. He's under a load of asphalt. Okay. All right. So what comes around, how's that go? Yeah. So, you had also, in this time of the so-called Protestant Reformation, the rise of European languages. Martin Luther did a tremendous work in putting the scriptures in the German language so that people would know the Word of God. But also, it gave status to the German language. And the German of Martin Luther has become, at least became in the beginning, the benchmark of German language usage. Likewise, people like Wycliffe and Tinsdale and who started wrote the scriptures of the English language, which eventually morphed into the King James Version of the scripture, along with Shakespeare, who lived in that area, crafted the usage of the English language and set the norm for good English usage. Up to that point, everything's done in Latin, and only the scholars could get it. The scriptures was only available if you knew Latin. But now, with the language in German scriptures, the German, the French, the English, yes. So the Word of God became available to the people, which in a sense is a very real blessing. But also, the language is developed. And that also has a disadvantage of people couldn't talk to each other. If these people were speaking German, these people were speaking French, and these people here were speaking Spanish, and these people here were speaking Italian, all that kind of thing, you know? So there were communication problems as well. Carrying on, this period of time also saw the rise of learning, advance of learning, art, creative artists like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael, music, Arcangelo Corelli and Scarlatti, and all over Europe. High culture. Going back to an era, it's called Renaissance or renewal or rebirth. Going back to the Greeks and the Romans, recovering and doing it their way. Also advances in science, like Copernicus and Galileo. Oxford University and Cambridge University and the University of London and Salamanca and Barcelona and Paris, other centers of high learning developed. Originally they were for the education of the monastics, but later on they became educational places for people from all over the world who were developing their minds. We also got an awful lot from southern Spain by way of the Jews and the Islamics who lived there, who had developed mathematics, medicine, and science to a very high degree. Then in 1492, 1492, King of Spain, which was comprised now of Castile and Aragon, King who? King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They were consolidating their kingdoms and creating Spain. They kicked out all of the Jews and all of the Islamics from southern Spain. And that's why Christopher Columbus couldn't find any ships to sail to the New World for exploration, because they were too busy shipping Jews and shipping Islamics anywhere in the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the Ionian Sea, or along the Atlantic coast, anywhere they could dump them, but that'd be out of Spain. It was a form of genocide, it was a pogrom. Thus went all that learning and all that talent. From that time on, people who had converted from Judaism or from Islam to Christianity, Catholicism, they were called either Moriscos or Moranos. That word mean anything to you? Moriscos or Moranos? It's a Spanish word. Moriscos or Moranos?
Seafood.
It's a seafood. But it also refers to people that had converted over, conversos from those two groups, Islamic or Jewish. But then they kept track. And so they would put M in front of the baptism record and J in front of the baptism record and marriage records for generations and centuries, just to be sure these people's conversion was not forced or artificial, but was truly for real. And the Inquisition was set up to be sure that they really were true and believing Roman Catholics and not just making a little show of it. So if they missed Mass, They might find themselves in a jail cell. Very coercive. And they better not dare light a menorah or have a candle lit during any of the Jewish holidays or festivals. And they better not circumcise their boys, because that means they're still Jews or they're still Islamic. Very, very strict like that. I helped a boy through seminary who's from Cuba. And he's now studying for the priesthood down in Florida. But he was up in San Francisco at the time. One time in a conversation I said, "Are you all Spanish?" Because he's from Cuba. He said, "No, not at all. I'm I'm Jewish. And my people have a big J written in front of their baptism book, in the baptism book, record book, to indicate that we are Jews." My grandfather and my father, they all have a big J in front of their name. Even though his name is Aristides, he knows that he's of a Jewish heritage. So there's an awful lot of anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic attitude in this kind of thing too. And we've not been free of it. But on the other hand, Martin Luther was anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. Okay, any questions so far?
Father, on the chronology here, it indicates that the Inquisition was finally suppressed in 1820. I didn't realize.
That was as an aftermath of the French Revolution, yes.
I didn't realize it lasted that long.
Yeah,
Okay.
Mhm.
But it wasn't as cruel as during the time of Isabel and Ferdinand, was it? I mean,
Well, nor Torquemada either,
wow.
but it was still an institution. I see a hand back there? No? Okay. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. And whether he was giving an outline of how to be a prince, or he was conveying how princes conducted themselves, whatever the motive for the book, it is an excellent presentation on how these people governed, how they stayed in power, how they manipulated and wove and dodged and this and that and the other thing. It's not a beautiful model, but it does tell us the story of how people were governed. This book here, A World Lit Only by Fire, says that only 1% of the people of Europe were in a position of power or responsibility. The rest were all very subject, deprived, living in little villages or little settlements that were not even on the map. So also, these people in power began to see themselves as consecrated by God to be the king, or the emperor, or the prince, or the duke. God made me the king of England. God made me the king of Spain. God made me the Duke of Normandy. God made me whatever they were. Divine right of kings. God. And when they were installed as king upon the death or the murder of their predecessor, They were anointed with chrism, sacred oil, as a symbol of this ordination as a king. I don't know if you remember when Queen Elizabeth was crowned the Queen of England. She was wearing priest vestments. She had a coat and she had other stuff on. And she was anointed with a chrism that apparently dates back from before the Reformation. Yeah. Must be pretty rancid stuff by this time, but there was an idea, a concept, that a king or a queen is right up there with archbishops and popes and stuff, in terms of the divine calling. And because they had this divine calling, everything they did was right, and nothing they ever did was wrong. Pretty arrogant, huh? Okay. During the Renaissance, and up to the present day, there's been a centralizing of power. Central governments, central rule. Up to that point, Europe was, and the rest of the world actually, for the most part, were little patches of turf by some little petty ruler. Germany, for example, was like a patchwork quilt. At one time, when I took a course in Western Europe, I had a map of Germany, of all the little places that were ruled all the way up the road. It was just amazing. The countless little patches of turf. And all these people eventually had to give way to an emperor or to a king who consolidated power and then centralized things. And one of the reasons that the French Revolution didn't totally devastate France is that they had at that point, at the time of the French Revolution, they had a very, very, very effective and efficient civil service set in place. And public officials who were not elected, but who were chosen, had their jobs, not out of patronage, not out of privilege, but because of excellence. They knew what they were doing. And that system has perdured, for example, in France to this day, and to a certain extent in England too. Though the English have had a tendency to muddle through a bit. I'm sorry, who's the lady with the tea? English have muddled through. Also, the occasion of the Reformation was an opportunity for a land grab. In England, under Cardinal Wolsey, he dissolved a few monasteries, convents that were marginal. Just a handful of monks, handful of nuns. They weren't making it financially, or they were struggling financially, or there was some scandal attached to the institution. So he was the papal legate. That meant he was more than the Archbishop of York. He was more than the Chancellor of the land. He also was the Pope's representative, acting in the name of the Pope in England. Tremendous amount of power for this son of a butcher. I said son of a butcher, or butcher's son. Rising from a butcher's son to being that high up in power. He also was used to the fine and high lifestyle. So the proceeds of these dissolved monasteries, they went into his pockets. And with it, he built a splendid place called Hampton Court. And he also used these funds to build Christ Church College in Oxford. And a few things like that. But when King Henry visited Hampton Court, he was really upset. Because here is this cardinal living in a grander and higher style than the king. So what do you think he did?
Asked for it.
Huh?
Asked for it.
Asked for it is a nice way. He took it. He took it. What's that buzzer? Are these all cell phones? Okay. So, from this experience of dissolving a few monasteries here and there, King Henry got the idea, after he had declared himself the head of the church in England, he didn't want any clergy around who were loyal to the Pope. They all had to be loyal to him as the head of the Church of England. So all these religious order priests, Dominicans, Franciscans, Benedictines, Cistercians, all the rest of them, they had allegiance to Pope or to a superior over in their continent somewhere. So he systematically, between 1535 and 1539, destroyed, abolished, confiscated all the monasteries and convents in England and Wales, even a few over in Ireland. He only kept one open. That was Wensleydale, because he liked the way they made their cheese. Beautiful buildings. Hit the wrecker's ball, hit them. Or they became residences of nobles. Either sold them to them or gave them to them or whatever. You know the little story, little Jack Horner sat in the corner eating his Christmas pie. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "My, what a good boy am I." What was that all about? It was a nursery rhyme, but it talked about little Jack Horner. Little Jack Horner was at a banquet, and there was a capsule of one of the greatest abbeys in England inside the pie, and it was supposed to go to the king. Well, he found out where it was, and he got that piece of pie. Well, the king had to honor whoever gets the capsule gets the abbey. Well, the king thought it was going to be, well, anyhow, Jack Horner got it instead. That's what that's all about. But when I visited England and Wales and Scotland, I visited an awful lot of these monasteries and abbeys. Some of them were truly beautiful. And Glastonbury, for example, they had about 800 monks there. They were living a good and holy life. And the abbot refused to surrender the abbey to the king. And so he was killed. He was killed rather than give up. He wouldn't give it up. So they killed him. But up to that point, abbots had an awful lot of power. I mean, he was the civil magistrate for that region, too. But that didn't mean anything to Henry. Henry was the most... You've heard the word vicious? V-I-C-I-O-U-S? Well, it means full of vice. Okay, Henry was the most vice-ridden king of these times. He was thoroughly greedy, utterly proud, utterly selfish, utterly lustful, an angry man. He indulged every single one of the vices to the nth degree, and he started out as a pretty nice guy. But he began to indulge his vices. Should be a warning to all of us. You know, even the best of us can go off the rails if we start to indulge ourselves in one give in to one temptation after another. We get better and better at being sinners, you know. Well, he did. He became a marvelous sinner. He killed his best friend, Thomas More, because Thomas said, "Henry, you are not the head of the church." That was treason in Henry's eyes. Thomas was his best friend. Ruthless people. His daughter wasn't much better. She killed her boyfriend because he had pretensions to be the king consort. With more than just a title, he wanted to help her rule the country. Sir Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Here we go again, bragging about my ancestors. You know, they say that a person who brags about his ancestors is admitting that his family is better off dead than alive. The Anglican Church that developed as a result of Henry's schism and on through to King Edward and then King James and Queen Elizabeth and all, was sort of a mix of Catholic and Lutheran and Presbyterian and a few other influences. It is to this present day. The Episcopalian, the Anglican, you can just believe in just about anything. It's okay. And you can have high liturgy, like high Roman Catholic, or you can have just kind of a low church. I think that maybe you're over in the Baptist church, something like that, you know? And still be Episcopalian. But right now, the Anglican Church, the Anglican community, the Episcopal Church is cracking apart, trying to hold all those various persuasions into one body of believers. It's just too hard to do. People do polarize. And people who are high principle about one thing or another thing, see these people as not having the same values or the same attitude or the same perspective. And they are creating a schism among a number of schisms, breakaway groups, to do it the right way.
Teacher talk.
As I mentioned earlier, and many times, Ecclesia est semper reformans. The church is always in a process of reformation. Always needing reformation, because we're dealing with two factors. Church is a divine institution run by, populated by humans. And what are humans? Humans are human. And humans are weak. Humans' tendency to sin. Humans mess things up. They don't get things right, and so on. So a great reform, like the Protestants initiated, also provoked a reform within the Catholic Church. So the Pope called a council that met in Trent in 1545, which was not long after Luther's activities and dissolution of the monasteries and all that. And so it was a council that met up in northern Italy, and it provided reform of the church, renewal of the church, made many correctives to the situation, and tossed out unworthy bishops, set up seminaries for the education of clergy, in imitation of Luther and Calvin, who likewise had set up seminaries for the education of pastors. And one man who implemented it marvelously well and really set the model, the standard for how to do seminary, was Charles Borromeo of Milan. He was a nobleman who'd been made a priest and a bishop when just a kid, really. But so many of them who were made whatever, like as a kid. For example, Leo X, who was the Pope during Luther's time, he was made an abbot at the age of 8. Now, what in the world did he know about running a monastery? At age 13, he was made a bishop. At age 14, he was made a cardinal. And at the age of 37, he was made the Pope. And when he was made Pope, he said, well, now I'm going to enjoy this. So Jesus didn't have much to do with anything. So the reform of Charles Borromeo was outstanding in the sense that even though he was on this fast track to the top, that wasn't important. For Charles Borromeo, what was important was to do what Christ wanted done. To live the gospel, to share the gospel, to be a faithful Catholic. And he reformed the clergy of Milan. He set up seminary for the education of the clergy. And Milan became a model diocese for the whole rest of the world. He was just one of many great people. Another great thinker was Robert Bellarmine. Another great thinker or spiritual man was St. Charles Francis de Sales, who was the Bishop of Geneva, but because of Don Calvin, he couldn't go to Geneva to run the place, so he ran it out of a place called Nancy in France, bordering Switzerland. And he had many confrontations with reformers, Protestant reformers, and he never, ever, once lost his temper. He never, ever once blew his cool. He was known always for being sweet, gentle, mild-mannered, kind, considerate. No matter what they said to him or about him or anything else, he was a true gentleman. True gentleman. And he wrote a book on the spiritual life. Up to that point, books on the spiritual life were pretty much geared to nuns and monks and friars and priests. But this was the first work for lay people on how to be a saint.
This is Bellarmine you're talking about now?
What?
This is Bellarmine you're
No,
talking about?
Francis de Sales.
Oh, de Sales.
Bellarmine was a theologian. He also didn't quite understand Galileo. But you can't be perfect. Another great thinker of the time was Thomas More, St. Thomas More. And Erasmus, another great thinker. And then Philip Neri was a great spiritual director. Did a lot of work with youth. He set up the model that we now use, even to this day, of campus ministry. Reaching young people when they're in the age of exploration and critical thinking and analysis, and responding to their genuine concerns. Another group that sprung up at this time were the Jesuits, or the Society or the Company of Jesus, by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And he gathered around him a number of other young men, Francis Borgia, Father Faber, and he pressured this university student, whether he were Francis Xavier from Spain, a noble, just pestered the bejeebers out of him to join him. And Francis said, "Oh, go away, old man. Yeah, get out of here, you booger. Yeah, get away, go away, go away." He didn't want anything to do with this older man that was studying theology and stuff. He was going to be a priest. He didn't want anything to do with him. But eventually he succumbed and he became a companion with them and became one of the greatest missionaries that the world has ever known. What's going on with that? He founded a society of Jesus, or the Company of Jesus, that was based upon the military model. What's going on up there?
Close the door.
Lady has a question, so Gloria's can take care of her. This
Oh.
has to do with the meeting place, things.
It was modeled after the You know, has anybody noticed it's a very busy parish?
Since you came, it's busier.
I'm supposed to be retired. Okay, we set up the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, on the military model, which was his training, his background. He was the military leader, a captain for the monarchs of Spain. And he was injured in battle. His leg was shattered, and it healed badly. So he was a vain man, and he didn't want to limp, and he didn't want it disfigured. So he submitted to breaking it again and resetting it. And he was bored to death as he recovered in this castle. So he wanted some exciting things to read, like military novels or sexy stuff. Instead, they gave him the life of Christ and the lives of the saints. First, but then he started to read it. He went on and read about heroes. He finally had a conversion experience. These people are real heroes. Real heroes. And when he got out of confinement, he dedicated his life to the Lord at Montserrat. And went eventually to the University of Paris and studied for the priesthood. At first, his effort was going to be to go to Islamic countries. Didn't happen. Instead, the Jesuits went into lands that had been converted to Lutheranism and to Calvinism, and these are scholarly men. There's hardly a dumb Jesuit in the whole world, then and now. They're a bright bunch. I have a tremendous admiration for Jesuits. That's it. You ought to know that by this time. But so they brought whole nations, whole countries, whole portions of countries back to the Catholic faith. And then, when we're going to talk next tonight, about the age of exploration and colonization. The missionaries accompanied the explorers. Francis Xavier, for example, went to the Indies, China, Japan, all those countries. And in India, he converted people right and left and sideways. He sometimes would have 1,000 baptisms in one day. And he set up a very stable church that survived persecutions for 400 more years. In India already, there were Thomas Christians who had been converted by Thomas the Apostle. They were in the south part in Kerala, but he was up in Goa and those other places in the central and northern. And those people to this day are likewise very, very faithful and good Catholics. Going back now, one of the other features of this Catholic Reformation, is uniform liturgies. Up to that point, up to the time of the Reformation, Mass was celebrated every which how way. And it was confusing. And in Italy, for example, more than half of the liturgies celebrated were in Latin, but according to the Byzantine usage, the same usage as Constantinople. Well, it was all abolished. It shouldn't have been, but it was. In the interest of a liturgy that was put together by the Pope and standardized, and that's what we have today. Now, in the world, you have 22 different ways of being a Catholic, with 22 different ways of celebrating liturgy, and it's all legitimate. Pope Pius V in 1570 created, he was a saint too, created what we would call our present liturgy. But there were two other liturgies in the Latin Church which survived this Council of Trent. One was the Ambrosian Rite of Northern Italy, Milan, Lombardy, and the Mozarabic Rite that dates from the 7th century in Spain. And then you've got the Eastern Catholics. You've got the Maronites and the Syrians and the Syro-Malabar, Syro-Malankara Catholics in India. You've got the Armenian Catholics, you've got the Chaldean Catholics, you've got the Albanian Byzantine, Bulgarian Greek Catholic, Byzantine Church of the Upper Key of Crimea, the Greek Catholics, the Hungarian Greeks, the Italo-Albanian Catholics, Macedonian Greek Catholic Church, the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, the Romanian Catholic Church, Russian Byzantine Catholic Church, the Ruthenian Catholic Church, Slovak Greek Catholic Church, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and now we have the Anglican Catholic Church that was created by Chiniquisana Gliganorum back in Benedict's time. So we also have revised our liturgy, and some of the people that are all in love with this liturgy of Pope Pius V that dates back from 1570, they're all bent out of shape. And they want to recreate their past, and they're trying their best to do it. I don't know, I have no sympathy for them. Because when I was a little boy, 4.5 years old, my grandfather, whom I've told this story before too, whom I greatly respected, said, "Tommy, Sunday Mass is going to be in the language of the people so they'll understand what's going on." That was 1942. Long before anybody else was thinking about these things. He also said, "Tommy, someday the altar is going to be a table rather than that pile of steeples on the back wall of the church. Tommy, someday the people are going to be expected to do more than run the bingo, take up the collection, and sing in the choir. They're all going to be expected to do a lot in the life of the church as it was in the beginning. All of that has come to pass." So I mentioned to Bishop Walsh one time that I've been a vernacular since I was 4.5, and he said, "You're talking crazy talk, Doctor." And so I told him the story, you know, about my granddad, I call him, and shut him up. But they had to have some kind of uniform liturgy, but it shouldn't have been that tough. Also, there was the beginning of lots of lay movements of spirituality. One was Devotio Moderna, and characteristic of Devotio Moderna was Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ. And so at one time it was as popular, almost as popular as the Bible. For people, it even looked like a Bible, the way it was bound. How many of you ever read the Imitation of Christ? How many of you still read the Imitation of Christ? That's good. When I was in philosophy in my last years of college, I wrote a paper against the Imitation of Christ of Thomas à Kempis, and I got an award for it from the Kentucky, Indiana Philosophical Society. A Critique of a Kempis was what it was called. And what I knocked in it was his antisocial attitude that he's saying that we shouldn't enter into the world of men and women because everyone gets defoiled and spoiled and dirtied by relating to people. That's crazy. It's crazy talk.
Yeah.
It's not very realistic either. I mean, we live in the midst of people. I understand from reading something today or yesterday, that Japanese youth are becoming very, very isolated because they're hooked on computers, and that's their only, and cell phones and all sort of thing. They don't interact with anybody, just this piece of
I
machinery.
don't think it's limited to the Japanese part.
What?
I don't think it's limited to
No,
the
no,
Japanese.
but this was talking about the Japanese.
I see.
But I mean, yeah, I know about others.
Yeah.
Good grief, I'll go to a restaurant, you got a man and a woman, or a boy and a girl, and instead of talking to each other, Shh. And when I'm with people, and they start doing that, they say, put it away. Or I'm gonna grab it, and I'm gonna put it under the wheel of this car, and I'm gonna ride right over it. And if I had a big, what's a big machine that they use to roll out the asphalt, steamroller, yeah. If I had enough money to buy a steamroller, I'd have everybody put those cell phones. I think that they're really affecting people's ability to relate socially one with another. That's my humble opinion.
It's
And
also
of course, you know that all my opinions are humble.
shortening their attention.
What's that?
It's also shortening their attention span.
Definitely, everything's in somebody. And it's producing radiation into their brains.
Come on.
Huh? Maybe. Whatever. Okay. Another form of devotion was quietism. Q-U-I-T-I-S-M. And it was a devotion in which we just submit ourselves in all peace to whatever movement God has. It's a form of contemplation or mystical experience, but it led to an awful lot of subjective, personalistic activity. At the same time was the beginning of another movement called Jansenism, which was a very moralistic, rigorous, harsh expression of Christianity, Catholicism, and it was a heresy which stayed within the church up until our young years, many of us. Very, very sin conscious, harsh. Very few people are going to be saved. Nobody should go to communion because everybody's so unworthy of this and that. All about a whole lot of unworthiness. God's one tough bird, and you better not mess with it. That kind of attitude. But they stayed within the church and did an awful lot of damage. A lot of convents of nuns were imbued with Jansenism. A lot of seminaries were rather Jansenistic. I know a few priests that were Jansenistic, old priests, but they were very much imbued with that negativity. And what the thing was, it seemed so okay. It was insidious. And people were very, very deeply hurt. Their consciences were malformed. And as a priest, when I hear people say, well, Father, I was raised in a strict Catholic home, I just cringe. Because some of that stuff that they passed for being authentic Christianity or Catholicism is way, way off. That's not the Jesus Christ of the scriptures of the gospel. This is a concoction of some hard-headed, rigid moralist. You're looking at me funny.
Well, I'm just thinking that those of us who are your age or older, I mean, pre-Vatican II, I mean, that was pretty much like that in terms of, at least in like my existence prior to pre-Vatican II. And I thought that was the church's response to the Reformation. That we said, okay, look, we're not going to let these guys form their own conscience. We're going to tell them what it is, and we're going to tell them what's right and wrong, and there's no gray in between. And then, of course, we lived through Vatican II, and now we see there's more than black and white and gray and so on. But
it was as close to Calvinism as Calvin. Yeah.
I mean, many of us remember, I mean, I couldn't go and date a non-Catholic girl. And my wife had to have my sister as her maid of honor because her best friend was a non-Catholic and she couldn't be in our wedding. And I couldn't go to a Joe's daughter's dance.
Right.
And all those, I mean, that kind of stuff. That was an enlightenment.
Okay, moving on. Been other groups that would be called penitentes and thrived in the Latino culture and in the Eastern Asia, where people would beat themselves, whip themselves, get crucified on Good Friday, fast to the point of almost death, run around the crown of thorns on Good Friday, crawl on their knees to some shrine until they're bloody, infected, died, beat each other up with whips, all because this is somehow a form of sanctification and purity. You had others who would make their food completely distasteful, so they could not even enjoy a good meal. No earthly pleasure. Could not smell a flower. Wouldn't smell a flower. Close their blinds on a beautiful scene. Anything like that. Just to make life as hard, as grim, and as penitential as possible. Hey, you know, this is nut stuff. In the past, for authentic Christianity, for authentic Catholicism, still a little bit of it going on. A little bit of it's still going on, but thank God, it's hopefully it's passed out. Then, very contrary to all of this, is the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, where people, again, were involved in what we would call critical thinking, scientific research, original thinking, reasoning things through. Up to this time, you couldn't do not. You couldn't take a cadaver and cut it up and find out how we work. It was just you just apparently you just use your imagination or remember something that Galen or somebody from the Greek era taught about, but without ever having seen a liver or a heart or a joint or a kidney or a liver or a bladder or whatnot, you know? So when people were freed of all of these constraints, then they began to learn a lot, learn a whole lot. Learn about circulation of blood, learn why people have both red and blue veins, all kinds of stuff like that. The church, again, reacted with fear. And they sometimes went after these scientists or these thinkers or these teachers. Oh, no. No, it says in the Bible. Okay, come on. Book of Genesis, world was made in 6 days. 6 days. That's only a literary form. Basically, it tells us God is creator. The how is up to science to figure out. All this, but they got so tangled up, afraid they would lose their position as teachers and all that. And then you got some real believers who were also good scientists, and I think they really paved the way, like Erasmus Galileo. And even later on, people like Louis Pasteur. So I assume it's true, but they'd say that Louis Pasteur was on a train. And his companion in this little compartment was a college, university student. So Louis took out a Bible and he read a few passages of the Bible, and then he closed his eyes and reflected. And then he took out his rosary and he said his rosary and stuff like that. And this young university student observed all this, and finally he said, "Sir, I don't mean to be rude, but have you heard of modern science?" And he said, "Well, tell me about this." So this little brash, have you heard the story, Mary?
Yes.
This little brash university student went on to explain about modern science and all this and all that, how there's no place for all this kind of prayers, believing in God and Jesus and all that, and reading Bibles in modern science. Oh, I'm glad to hear you. Glad to listen to you. Can we talk about this later? Because I have to get off the train. Here's my card. So he just took the card and stuffed it in his pocket. And then when he got home and emptied his pockets, he looked at this Catholic man that he'd been giving a hard time to, Dr. Louis Pasteur. So he was a thinker, man of science. He saw no conflict between science and religion, between reason and divine. I don't either. There isn't any problem. We all search for truth. God is truth. And so there's no one single truth that's going to untruth another. It's all part of participation in the truth who is God. And it's up to us to find out what, how, and why. So everybody feels sorry for that guy that's all crippled up with some kind of a palsy. What's his name?
Hawking?
Yeah, Hawking's. Yeah. Okay, there were advances in medicine, of course, and advances in science. Recovery of authentic history. History began to be written about who did what happened, why. And up to that point, up to the Renaissance, history, and even a little bit in the Renaissance, but after that, it was like making a good case for this famous person, leaving out all the bad stuff, of course. It wasn't at all objective. It was very promotional in a sense. Sometimes somebody who was a so-called historian would write about the father or the mother of some famous person, or about the predecessor of some king or whatnot. It will all be in glowing terms. That's not history. Then there was the Age of Discovery. 1492, October 12th, Christopher Columbus landed in the New World, down the Caribbean. And Spain and Portugal took over South and Central America. His famous, wonderful, sinful Pope, Alexander VI, split up. They didn't know about North America yet. Split up South America, part for the Portuguese and part for Spain. And I think he thinks he gave the bigger portion to Spain because he was a Spaniard himself, Portugal, so he showed favoritism to Spain, not to Portugal. But Portugal got a good chunk too, with Brazil and the neighboring countries. And then the French came, into the New World, and then the English came. Unfortunately, I'm descended from both of them. I found out, well, I knew for the longest time that my grandmother's, my father's people, my mother's grandparents, came in 1686 from Normandy with the Jesuits to evangelize the New World, to convert the Mohawks to Christianity, and the Chippewa and the Ojibwe and the Huron Indians, Potawatomi and the Miamis and all those people. Then I found out, after my mother died, she had a genealogy of her grandmother's father's people. And I knew that my great-grandmother was bitterly anti-Catholic. I didn't know why. But she disinherited my grandfather when he became a Catholic. My grandfather and my grandmother had 12 children, and 8 of them died as infants. My mother went blind as a little girl. She went to a new doctor in town, Dr. John Devereux, my father, and he restored her sight. My uncle Bill developed polio, or infantile paralysis, as they called it in those days. It was Depression time and also Prohibition time. My grandfather was making booze, and he had 5 businesses: general contractor, trucking company, delicatessen, chain of grocery stores, and a dairy. And he lost them all, began to lose them all in the Depression. And he was drinking quite heavily. Then their eldest son was ready to be married in a few weeks to a wonderful woman by the name of Mary McCormick. He was on the Great Lakes as a sailor, and his wife-to-be said, "Harvey, I want you to get off the lakes and get a land job," which he did. On the way back from the hire, he hailed a buddy of his had been from high school, and he lost his grip, his footing on the delivery truck, and he was crushed to death under the rear wheels of this truck. Well, my grandfather went to pieces when all these tragedies struck. But he saw the faith of my grandmother, which Catholic lady, which sustained her, and he wanted that kind of faith. So he became a Catholic. In doing so, his mother refused to help him in any way, shape, or form, save his businesses. Finally, when he lost his home, she gave him a rental cottage. She's a very wealthy woman. She owned about 25% of our city. The whole north end was her property, their property. Very, very rich lady. Well, when the old lady died, my grandfather got a glass slipper for the whatnot shelf. That's it. The other 2 kids got everything. Okay, so I wondered why she was great-grandma was so bitterly anti-Catholic, and my mother had this genealogy of her people, these, and I read it a few months ago. On my great-grandmother's father's side, we go all the way back to Henry VIII, and there's a whole string of Protestants, Puritans, Anglicans, from Henry VIII in Massachusetts all the way down to the time they moved into Michigan in the 1800s. I got Anglican priests and ministers and Presbyterian parsons and deacons and everybody else in my line. That ought to make your English stir up.
No wonder you're interested in ecumenism, Father.
I think I come by it naturally.
Genetically.
Some young man wants me to bury his stepfather this weekend, but he said, I don't know if I want a Catholic priest because I don't want a Catholic funeral. So I said, I know how to do Protestant ones, so. Okay, the age of discovery opened up the rest of the world to Europe, European exploration and colonization. Colonization is a hard business. Yes, it provided missionary activity, provided an opportunity or an avenue for the church to reach out to people who had not known Christ. The colonizers, with the exception of possibly of the French, were a wicked bunch. They thought of these people as subhuman. They exploited them. They enslaved them. They beat them. They destroyed their civilizations. What they did in Mexico was unconscionable. They completely destroyed a whole culture. What they did with the Incas, and the Aztecs, and the Mayans, and the Toltecs was it's evil. They went over to India. They found these people who were practicing Christians, Syro-Malabar and Syro-Malankar, we call them now, they call them Thomas Christians. But because these Portuguese had never heard that St. Thomas was their apostle, that he was buried in a tomb, and that they were Catholics, they never knew about this, therefore these folks aren't for real. And they're not doing things like we do them. So they said, let's have a meeting and discuss this. So they rounded up a whole bunch of these bishops on a ship for a meeting, and then they jumped ship, set the ship on fire, and burned these bishops to death. There were a few old bishops who didn't make the trip, and they reestablished the church and set up more bishops again by ordaining them. And then they steered clear of the Portuguese from then on. Wouldn't have anything to do with the Latin Church or the Roman Catholics. And they only came back under the aegis or the auspices of Marianios, who was a meaningful conversation with Archbishop Edward Mooney, who eventually became the Archbishop of Detroit, Edward Garner Mooney. He brought them back into union with Rome. In our lifetime, my lifetime, we've had about 10 priests in this diocese who come out of that heritage of Thomas Christian. So, but very intolerant, very cruel. In Mexico, they were making no headway whatsoever in the conversion of anybody. Who would want to be a part of this cruel bunch? It took the Blessed Mother herself coming down from heaven and Tepeyac, Lady Guadalupe we call her. Compassionate Mother.
What about Father Sarah?
Hmm?
Father Sarah.
Well, that's another matter. There was also Eusebio Kino, a lot of others like that. They say that he beat the Indians or whipped them or all that kind of thing. Well, in those days, the bishop would slap around his priests. Mother Superior would slap around her nuns.
The nuns would slap around us.
It's lucky that my ear isn't like this all the time. And when I was in 1st to 4th grade, I spent an inordinate amount of time in the cloakroom. Because I would answer the question, she wouldn't answer by hand, so I'd blurt out the answer. Well, the kids were all stunned around, I knew the answer. I was punished for being too smart. So I know the smell of pig salad sandwiches and salami.
Being smart was my problem.
And this is back in Michigan, so you've got the the smell of woolen Mackinaw jackets and
Yeah.
watches and,
Wet.
I know about all that. Okay, so you took the lady, our lady, to bring about the conversion of the people in Mexico, but then you got Junipero Serra, and he was not acting any differently than any other superior or religious or otherwise. A military officer would slap his troops around, his soldiers around. Even today, you've got sergeants that are, drill sergeants that are pretty rough on their people. Yeah, so they were rough, But everybody was rough. And kings would slap around the people in their court. Teachers would whip kids every day just because, whether they needed it or not. Just to keep them in line, just to be sure that they don't get to be smart alecks, that kind of thing. So we have to look at things in that context. Not that I approve. You had an educator, John Baptist de La Salle, who started the Christian Brothers, and he was opposed to this sort of slapping people around, hitting kids. But he was a rare bird in those days. The colonization was really exploitation of a people's. And what they do, they took the good stuff back to Europe, took the good stuff back to Spain, took the good stuff back to Portugal, for centuries. And in doing so, they deprived themselves of developing their own land. Okay? As one Chilean person said, they're even taking our dirt away from us. Even taking our dirt away from us. They also treated the colonists, those who would come from Spain or Portugal or England, as second, third-class citizens, and exploited them as well. It's one of the reasons the American Revolution happened. We refused anymore to be treated like colonists. We wanted the rights of Englishmen. Well, we didn't get them. It's one of the reasons that the Irish rebelled for so long. They wanted the rights of Englishmen. Well, didn't get it, so they went on their own. From 1701. They were rebelling against England because England wasn't treating them with any respect whatsoever. Colonization also is exploitation. It's also culturally insensitive. It's trying to make people into what you are. The French were different. They accepted an awful lot of the culture of the people that their colonies. But the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the English just wanted to turn these people into little Englishmen or little Spaniards or little Portuguese. And they were completely insensitive to the culture, to the language, to the history, the whole bit of these people, these subject people. And in some instances, they consider them to be less than human, like a notch above a monkey. And then when they also brought diseases with them that these people had no immunity to, and so they ran out of slaves, so they went to Africa and loaded up ships and brought those poor people over in order to do all the hard labor. So it was a very, very dirty business, very dirty business. And it's not to be admired. Was also the rise of nationalism, where Spain controlled a good portion of the earth. England controlled a great portion of the earth. France, a considerable portion of the earth. Gave them a sense of superiority. Okay. I think it's time to quit telling stories. It's now 8 o'clock.